Chapter 16 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 16 In Touch with the Missing. Sir Cresswell Oliver took the cablegram from Petherton and read it over slowly, muttering the precise and plain wording to himself. "Don't you think, Petherton, that we had better get a clear notion of our exact bearings?" he said, as he laid it back on the solicitor's desk. "Seems to me that the time's come when we ought to know exactly where we are. As I understand it, the case is this rightly or wrongly, we suspect the present holder of the Scarhaven estates. We suspect that he is not the rightful owner that, in short, he is no more the real Marston Greyle than you are. We think that he's an impostor, posing as Marston Greyle. Other people Mrs. Valentine Greyle, for example evidently think so too. Am I right?" "Quite," responded Petherton. "That's our position, exactly." "Then, in that case, what I want to get at is this," continued Sir Cresswell. "How does this relate to my brother's death? What's the connection? That, to me at any rate, is the first thing of importance. Of course, I have a theory. This that the impostor did see my brother last Sunday afternoon, that he knew that my brother would at once know that he, the impostor, was not the real Marston Greyle, and that the discovery would lead to detection, and therefore he put him out of the way. He might accompany him to the top of the tower and fling him down it's possible. Do you follow me?" "Precisely," replied Petherton. "I, too, incline to that notion, though I've worked it out in a different fashion. My reconstruction of what took place at Scarhaven Keep is as follows. I think that Bassett Oliver met the Squire we'll call this man that for the sake of clearness when he entered the ruins. He probably introduced himself, and mentioned that he had met a Marston Greyle in America. Then the Squire saw the probabilities of detection, and what subsequently took place was most likely what you suggest. It may have been that the Squire recognized Bassett Oliver, and knew that he'd met Marston Greyle. It may have been that he didn't know him and didn't know anything until Bassett Oliver enlightened him. But either way, I firmly believe that Bassett Oliver came to his death by violence that he was murdered. So there's the case in a nutshell murdered to keep his tongue still." "What's to be done, then?" asked Sir Cresswell as Petherton tapped the cablegram. "The first thing," he answered, "is to make use of this. We now know that the real Marston Greyle, who certainly did live in St. Louis, where his father had settled, left New York for England to take up his inheritance on September 28th, 1912, and booked a passage to Falmouth. He would land at Falmouth from the Araconda about October 5th. Probably there is some trace of him at Falmouth. He no doubt stayed a night there. Anyway, somebody must go to Falmouth and make inquiries. You'd better go, Gilling, and at once. While you're away your partner had better resume his search for the man we know as the Squire. You've two good clues the fact that he visited the Fragonard Club, and that particular tobacconist's shop. Urge Swallow to do his best the man must be kept in sight. See to both these things immediately." "Swallow is at work already," replied Gilling. "He's got good help, too, and his failure yesterday has put him on his mettle. As for me, I'll go to Falmouth by the next express. Let me have that cablegram." "I'll go with you," said Copplestone. "I may be of some use and I'm interested. But" he paused and looked questioningly at the old solicitor. "What about the other news we brought you?" he asked. "About this sale of the estate, you know. If this man is an impostor " "Leave that to me," replied Petherton, with a shrewd glance at Sir Cresswell. "I know the Greyle family solicitors highly respectable people, only a few doors away, in fact, and I'm going round to have a quiet little chat with them in a few minutes. There will be no sale leave me to deal with that matter. And if you young men are going to Falmouth, off you go." It was late that night when Copplestone and Gilling arrived at this far off Cornish seaport, and nothing could be done until the following morning. To Copplestone it seemed as if they were in for a difficult task. Over 12 months had elapsed since the real Marston Greyle left America for England. He might not have stayed in Falmouth, might not have held any conversation with anybody there who would recollect him. How were they going to trace him? But Gilling, now free of his clerical attire and presenting himself as a smart young man of the professional classes type, was quick to explain that system accurate and definite system would expedite matters. "We know the approximate date on which the Araconda would touch here," he said, as they breakfasted together. "As things go, it would be from October 4th to 6th, according to the quickness of her run across the Atlantic. Very well if Marston Greyle stayed here, he'd have to stay at some hotel. Accordingly, we visit all the Falmouth hotels and examine their registers of that date first week of October, 1912. If we find his name, good! We can then go on to make inquiries. If we don't find any trace of him, then we know it's all up he probably went straight away by train after landing. We'll begin with this hotel first." There was no record of any Marston Greyle at that hotel, nor at the next half dozen at which they called. A visit to the shipping office of the line to which the Araconda belonged revealed the fact that she reached Falmouth on October 5th at 10:30 in the evening, and that the name of Marston Greyle was on the list of first class passengers. Gilling left the office in cheery mood. "That simplifies matters," he said. "As the Araconda reached here late in the evening, the passengers who landed from her would be almost certain to stay the night in Falmouth. So we've only to resume our round of these hotels in order to hit something pertinent. This is plain and easy work, Copplestone no corners in it. We'll strike oil before noon." They struck oil at the very next hotel they called at an old fashioned house in close proximity to the harbour. There was a communicative landlord there who evidently possessed and was proud of a retentive memory, and he no sooner heard the reason of Gilling's call upon him than he bustled into activity and produced the register of the previous year. "But I remember the young gentleman you're asking about," he remarked, as he took the book from a safe and laid it open on the table in his private room. "Not a common name, is it? He came here about 11 o'clock of the night you've mentioned. There you are there's the entry. And there, higher up, is the name of the man who came to meet him. He came the day before, to be here when the Araconda got in." The two visitors, bending over the book, mutually nudged each other as their eyes encountered the signatures on the open page. There, in the handwriting of the letters which Mr. Dennie had so fortunately preserved, was the name Marston Greyle. But it was not the sight of that which surprised them. They had expected to see it. What made them both thrill with the joy of an unexpected discovery was the sight of the signature inserted some lines above it under date October 4th. Lest they should exhibit that joy before the landlord, they mutually stuck their elbows into each other and immediately affected the unconcern of indifference. But there the signature was Peter Chatfield. Peter Chatfield! They both knew that they were entering on a new stage of their quest that the fact that Chatfield had travelled to Falmouth to meet the new owner of Scarhaven meant much, possibly meant everything. "Oh!" said Gilling, as steadily as possible. "That gentleman came to meet the other, did he? Just so. Now, what sort of man was he?" "Big, fleshy man elderly very solemn in manner and appearance," answered the landlord. "I remember him well came in about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 4th, just after the London train arrived, and booked a room. He told me he expected to meet a gentleman from New York, and was very fidgety about fixing it up to go off in the tender to the Araconda when she came into the bay. However, I found out for him that she wouldn't be in until next evening, so of course he settled down to wait. Very quiet, reserved old fellow never said much." "Did he go off on the tender next night?" asked Gilling. "He did, and came back with this other gentleman and his baggage. This Mr. Greyle," answered the landlord. "Mr. Chatfield had booked a room for Mr. Greyle." "And what sort of man was Mr. Greyle?" inquired Gilling. "That's really the important thing. You've an exceptionally good memory I can see that. Tell us all you can recollect about him." "I can recollect plenty," replied the landlord, shaking his head. "As for his looks a tallish, slightly built young fellow, between, I should say, 25 and 28. Stooped a good bit. Very dark hair and eyes a good deal sunken in his face. Very pale. Good looking, good features. But ill. My sakes, he was ill!" "Ill!" exclaimed Gilling, with a glance at Copplestone. "Really ill?" "He was that ill," said the landlord, "that me and my wife never expected to see him get up that next morning. We wanted them to have a doctor, but Mr. Greyle himself said that it was nothing, but that he had some heart trouble and that the voyage had made it worse. He said that if he took some medicine which he had with him, and a drop of hot brandy and water, and got a good night's sleep, he'd be all right. And next morning he seemed better, and he got up to breakfast, but my wife said to me that if she'd seen death on a man's face it was on his. She's a bit of a persuasive tongue, has my wife, and when she heard that these two gentlemen were thinking of going a long journey right away to the far north it was, I believe she got 'em to go and see the doctor first, for she felt that Mr. Greyle wasn't fit for the exertion." "Did they go?" asked Gilling. "They did. I talked myself to the old gentleman," replied the landlord, "and I showed them the way to our own doctor, Dr. Tretheway, and as a result of what he said to them, I heard them decide to break up their journey into stages, as you might term it. They left here for Bristol that afternoon, to stay the night there." "You're sure of that Bristol?" asked Gilling. "Ought to be," replied the landlord, with laconic assurance. "I went to the station with them and saw them off. They booked to Bristol, anyway first class." Gilling looked at his companion. "I think we'd better see this Dr. Tretheway," he remarked. Dr. Tretheway, an elderly man of grave manners and benevolent aspect, remembered the visit of Mr. Marston Greyle well enough when he had turned up its date in his case book. He also remembered the visitor's companion, Mr. Chatfield, who seemed unusually anxious and concerned about Mr. Greyle's health. "And as to that," continued Dr. Tretheway, "I learned from Mr. Greyle that he had been seriously indisposed for some months before setting out for England. The voyage had been rather a rough one. He had suffered much from sea sickness, and in his state of health that was unfortunate for him. I made a careful examination of him, and I came to the conclusion that he was suffering from a form of myocarditis which was rapidly assuming a very serious complexion. I earnestly advised him to take as much rest as possible, to avoid all unnecessary fatigue and all excitement, and I strongly deprecated his travelling in one journey to the north, whither I learned he was bound. On my advice, he and Mr. Chatfield decided to break that journey at Bristol, at Birmingham, and at Leeds. By so doing, you see, they would only have a short journey each day, and Mr. Greyle would be able to rest for a long time at a stretch. But I formed my own conclusions." "And they were what?" asked Gilling. "That he would not live long," said the doctor. "Finding that he was going to the neighbourhood of Norcaster, where there is a most excellent school of medicine, I advised him to get the best specialist he could from there, and to put himself under his treatment. But my impression was that he had already reached a very, very serious stage." "You think he was then likely to die suddenly?" suggested Gilling. "It was quite possible. I should not have been surprised to hear of his death," answered Dr. Tretheway. "He was, in short, very ill indeed." "You never heard anything?" inquired Gilling. "Nothing at all though I often wondered. Of course," said the doctor, with a smile, "they were only chance visitors. I often have transatlantic passengers drop in, and they forget that a physician would sometimes like to know how a case submitted to him in that way has turned out. No, I never heard any more." "Did they give you any address, either of them?" asked Copplestone, seeing that Gilling had no more to ask. "No," replied the doctor, "they did not. I knew, of course, from what they told me that Mr. Greyle had come off the Araconda the night before, and that he was passing on. No, I only gathered that they were going to the neighbourhood of Norcaster from the fact that Mr. Greyle asked if a journey to that place would be too much for him. He said with a laugh that over there in the United States a journey of 500 miles would be considered a mere jaunt. He was very plucky, poor fellow, but " Dr. Tretheway ended with a significant shake of the head, and his two visitors left him and went out into the autumn sunlight. "Copplestone," said Gilling as they walked away, "that chap the real Marston Greyle is dead. That's as certain as that we're alive. And now the next thing is to find out where he died and when and, by George, that's going to be a big job!" "How are you going to set about it?" asked Copplestone. "It seems as if we were up against a blank wall now." "Not at all, my son," retorted Gilling, cheerfully. "One step at a time that's the sure thing to go on, in my calling. We've found out a lot here, and quickly, too. And we know where our next step lies Bristol. Like looking for needles in a bundle of hay? Not a bit of it. If those two broke their journey at Bristol, they'd have to stop at a hotel. Well, now we'll adjourn to Bristol, bearing in mind that we're on the track of Peter Chatfield." Chapter 17. Of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 17 The Old Playbill Gilling's cheerful optimism was the sort of desirable quality that is a good thing to have, but all the optimism in the world is valueless in face of impregnable difficulty. And the difficulty of tracing Chatfield and his sick companion, in a city the size of Bristol, did indeed seem impregnable when Gilling and Copplestone had been attacking it for 24 hours. They had spent a whole day in endeavouring to get news; they had gone in and out of hotels until they were sick of the sight of one; they had made exhaustive inquiries at the railway station, and of the cabmen who congregated there. Nobody remembered anything at all about a big, heavy faced man, and a man in his company who seemed to be very ill. And on the second night Copplestone intimated plainly that in his opinion they were wasting their time. "How do we even know that they ever came to Bristol?" he asked, as he and Gilling refreshed themselves with a much needed dinner. "The Falmouth landlord saw Chatfield take tickets for Bristol that's nothing to go on. Put it to yourself in this way Greyle may have found even that journey too much for him. They may in that case have left the train at Plymouth, or at Exeter, or at Taunton. It would stop at each place. Seems to me we're wasting time here. Far better get nearer more tangible things. Chatfield, for instance, or go back to town and find out what your friend Swallow has done." "Swallow," replied Gilling, "has done nothing so far, or I should have heard. Swallow knows exactly where I am, and where I shall be until I give him further notice. Don't be discouraged, my friend. One is often on the very edge of a discovery when one seems to be miles away from it. Give me another day, and if we haven't found out something by tomorrow evening I'll consult with you as to our next step. But I've a plan for tomorrow morning which ought to yield some result." "What?" demanded Copplestone doubtfully. "This there is in every centre of population an official who registers births, marriages, and deaths. Now we believe the real Marston Greyle to be dead. Let us suppose, for argument's sake, that he did die here, in Bristol, whither he and Chatfield certainly set off when they left Falmouth. What would happen? Notice of his death would have to be given to the registrar, by the nearest relative or by the person in attendance on the deceased. That person would in this case be Chatfield. If the death occurred suddenly and without medical assistance, an inquest would have to be held. If a doctor had been in attendance, he would give a signed certificate of the cause of death, which he would hand to the relatives or friends in attendance, who in their turn would have to hand it in to the registrar. Do you see the value of these points? What we must do tomorrow morning is to see the registrar or as there will be more than one in a place this size, each of them in turn, in the endeavour to find out if, early in October, 1912, Peter Chatfield registered the death of Marston Greyle here. But remember, he may not have registered it under that name. He may indeed not have used his own name he's deep enough for anything. That, however, is our next best chance search of the registers. Let's try it, anyway, first thing in the morning. And as we've had a stiff day, I propose we dismiss all thought of this affair for the rest of the evening, and betake ourselves to some place of amusement. Theatre, eh?" Copplestone made no objection to that, and when dinner was over, they walked round to the principal theatre, in time for the first act of a play which, having been highly successful in London, had just started on a round of the leading provincial theatres. Between the second and third acts of this production there was a long interval, and the two companions repaired to the foyer to recuperate their energies with a drink and a cigarette. While thus engaged, Copplestone encountered an old school friend with whom he exchanged a few words. Gilling meanwhile strolled about, inspecting the pictures, photographs and old playbills on the walls of the saloon and its adjacent apartments. And suddenly he turned back, waited until Copplestone's acquaintance had gone away, and then hurried up and smacked his co-searcher on the shoulder. "Didn't I tell you that one's often close to a thing when one seems furthest off it?" he exclaimed triumphantly. "Come here, my son, and look at what I've just found." He drew Copplestone away to a quiet corner and pointed out an old playbill, framed and hung on the wall. Copplestone stared at it and saw nothing but the title of a well known comedy, the names of one or two fairly celebrated actors and actresses, and the usual particulars which appear on all similar announcements. "Well?" he asked. "What of this?" "That?" replied Gilling, flicking the tip of his finger on a line in the bill. "That, my boy." Copplestone looked again. He started at what he read. Margaret Sayers, Miss Adela Chatfield. "And now look at that," continued Gilling, with an accentuation of his triumphal note. "See? These people were here for a fortnight, from October 3rd to 17th, 1912. Therefore, if Peter Chatfield brought Marston Greyle to Bristol on October 6th, Peter Chatfield's daughter would also be in the town." Copplestone looked over the bill again, rapidly realizing possibilities. "Would Chatfield know that?" he asked reflectively. "It's only likely that he would," replied Gilling. "Even if father and daughter don't quite hit things off in their tastes, it's only reasonable to suppose that Peter would usually know his daughter's whereabouts. And if he brought Greyle here, ill, and they had to stop, it's only likely that Peter would turn to his daughter for help. Anyway, Copplestone, here are two undoubted facts. Chatfield and Greyle booked from Falmouth for Bristol on October 6th, 1912, and may therefore be supposed to have come here. That's one fact. The other is Addie Chatfield was certainly in Bristol on that date and for 11 days after it." "Well, what next?" asked Copplestone. "I've been thinking that over while you stared at the bill," answered Gilling. "I think the best thing will be to find out where Addie Chatfield put herself up during her stay. I daresay you know that in most of these towns there are lodgings which are almost exclusively devoted to the theatrical profession. Actors and actresses go to them year after year; their owners lay themselves out for their patrons. What's more, your theatrical landlady always remembers names and faces, and has her favourites. Now, in my stage experience, I never struck Bristol, so I don't know much about it, but I know where we can get information the stage doorkeeper. He'll tell us where the recognized lodgings are, and then we must begin a round of inquiry. When? Just now, my boy and a good time, too, as you'll see." "Why?" asked Copplestone. "Best hour of the evening," replied Gilling, with glib assurance. "Landladies enjoying an hour of ease before beginning to cook supper for their lodgers, now busy on the stage. Always ready to talk, theatrical landladies, when they've nothing to do. Trust me for knowing the ropes. Come round to the stage door and let's ask the keeper a question or two." But before they had quitted the foyer an interruption came in the shape of a shrewd looking gentleman in evening dress, who wore his opera hat at a rakish angle and seemed to be very much at home as he strolled about, hands in pockets, looking around him at all and sundry. He suddenly caught sight of Gilling, smiled surprisedly and expansively, and came forward with outstretched hand. "Bless our hearts, is it really yourself, dear boy?" exclaimed this apparition. "Really, now! And what brings you here? God bless my soul and eyes, why, I haven't seen you this how long is it, dear boy?" "3 years," answered Gilling, promptly clasping the outstretched hand. "But what are you doing here? Boss, eh?" "Lessee's manager, dear boy nice job, too," whispered the other. "Been here 2 years good berth." He deftly steered Gilling towards the refreshment bar, and glanced out of his eye corner at Copplestone. "Friend of yours?" he suggested hospitably. "Introduce us, dear boy. My name is the same as before, as you know." "Mr. Copplestone Mr. Montmorency," said Gilling. "Mr. Montmorency Mr. Copplestone." "Servant, sir," said Mr. Montmorency. "Pleased to meet any friend of my friend. And what will you take, dear boys? And how are things with you, Gilling, old man? Now, who on earth would have thought of seeing you here?" Copplestone held his peace while Gilling and Mr. Montmorency held interesting converse. He was sure that his companion would turn this unexpected meeting to account, and he therefore felt no surprise when Gilling, after giving him a private nudge, plumped the manager with a direct question. "Did you see Addie Chatfield when she was here about a year ago?" he asked. "You remember, she was here in Mrs. Swain's necklace here a fortnight." "I remember very well, dear boy," responded Mr. Montmorency, with a judicial sip at the contents of his tumbler. "I saw the lady several times. More by token, I accidentally witnessed a curious little scene between Miss Addie and a gentleman whom nature appeared to have specially manufactured for the part of heavy parent you know the type. One morning when that company was here, I happened to be standing in the vestibule, talking to the box office man, when a large, solemn-faced individual, Quakerish in attire, and evidently not accustomed to the theatre, walked in and peered about him at our rich carpets and expensive fittings, pretty much as if he was appraising their value. At the same time, I observed that he was in what one calls a state a little perhaps a good deal upset about something, wherefore I addressed myself to him in my politest manner, and inquired if I could serve him. Thereupon he asked if he could see Miss Adela Chatfield on very important business. Now, I wasn't going to let him see Miss Addie, for I took him to be a man who might have a writ about him, or something nasty of that sort, but at that very moment Miss Addie, who had been rehearsing, and had come out by the house instead of going through the stage door, came tripping into the vestibule and let off a sharp note of exclamation, after which she and the old wooden face stepped into the street together and immediately exchanged a few words. And that the old man told her something very serious was abundantly evident from the expression of their respective countenances. But of course I never knew what it was, nor who he was, dear boy not my business, don't you know." "They went away together, those two?" asked Gilling, favouring Copplestone with another nudge. "Up the street together, certainly, talking most earnestly," replied Mr. Montmorency. "Ever see that old chap again?" asked Gilling. "I never did, dear boy once was sufficient," said Mr. Montmorency lightly. "But," he continued, dropping his bantering tone, "are these questions pertinent? Has this to do with this new profession of yours, dear boy? If so, mum's the word, you know." "I'll tell you what, Monty," answered Gilling. "I wish you'd find out for me where Addie Chatfield lodged when she was here that time. Can it be done? Between you and me, I do want to know about that, old chap. Never mind why, now I will tell you later but it's serious." Mr. Montmorency tapped the side of his handsome nose. "All right, my boy," he said. "I understand. Wicked, wicked world! Done? Dear boy, it shall be done. Come down to the stage door. Our man knows every landlady in the town." By various winding ways and devious passages he led the two young men down to the stage door. Its keeper, not being particularly busy at that time, was reading the evening newspaper in his glass walled box, and glanced inquiringly at the strangers as Mr. Montmorency pulled them up before him. "Brickett," said Mr. Montmorency, leaning into the sanctum over its half door and speaking confidentially, "you keep a sort of register of lodgings, don't you, Brickett? Now I wonder if you could tell me where Miss Adela Chatfield, of the Mrs. Swain's Necklace Company, stopped when she was last here that's a year ago or about it. Brickett," he went on, turning to Gilling, "puts all this sort of thing down methodically, so that he can send callers on, or send up urgent letters or parcels during the day. Isn't that it, Brickett?" "That's about it, sir," answered the doorkeeper. He had taken down a sort of ledger as the manager spoke, and was now turning over its leaves. He suddenly ran his finger down a page and stopped its course at a particular line. "Mrs. Salmon, 5 Montargis Crescent, second to the right outside," he announced briefly. "Very good lodgings, too, are those." Gilling promised Mr. Montmorency that he would look him up later on, and went away with Copplestone to Montargis Crescent. Within 5 minutes they were standing in a comfortably furnished, old fashioned sitting room, liberally ornamented with the photographs of actors and actresses, and confronting a stout, sharp eyed little woman who listened intently to all that Gilling said, and sniffed loudly when he had finished. "Remember Miss Chatfield being here?" she exclaimed. "I should think I do remember I ought to! Bringing mortal sickness into my house, and then death, and then a funeral! And her and her father going away, never giving me an extra penny for the trouble." Chapter 18 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 18 The Lie on the Tombstone. Gilling's glance at his companion was quiet enough, but it spoke volumes. Here, by sheer chance, was such a revelation as they had never dreamed of hearing. Here was the probable explanation of at least half the mystery. He turned composedly to the landlady. "I've already told you who and what I am," he said, pointing to the card which he had handed to her. "There are certain mysterious circumstances about this affair which I want to get at. What you said just now is abundant evidence that you can help. If you do and will help, you'll be well paid for your trouble. Now, you speak of sickness, death, a funeral. Will you tell us all about it?" "I never knew there was any mystery about it," answered the landlady, as she motioned her visitors to seat themselves. "It was all above board as far as I knew. Of course, I've always been sore about it. I had a great deal of trouble, and, as I say, I never got anything for it that is, anything extra. And me doing it really to oblige her and her father." "They brought a sick man here?" suggested Gilling. "I'll tell you how it was," said Mrs. Salmon, seating herself and showing signs of a disposition to confidence. "Miss Chatfield, she'd been here, I think, 3 days that time. I'd had her once before, a year or two previous. One morning I'm sure it was about the 3rd day that the Swain Necklace Company was here she came in here from rehearsal in a regular take on. She said that her father had just called on her at the theatre. She said he'd been to Falmouth to meet a relation of theirs who'd come from America and had found him to be very ill on landing so ill that a Falmouth doctor had given strict orders that he mustn't travel any further than Bristol, on his way wherever he wanted to go. They'd got to Bristol, and the young man was so done up that Mr. Chatfield had had to drive him to another doctor, one close by here, Dr. Valdey, as soon as they arrived. Dr. Valdey said he must go to bed at once and have at least 2 days' complete rest in bed, and he advised Mr. Chatfield to get quiet rooms instead of going to a hotel. So Mr. Chatfield, knowing that his daughter was here, d'ye see, sought her out and told her all about it. She came to me and asked me if I knew where they could get rooms. Well, now, I had my drawing room floor empty that week, and as it was only for 2 or 3 days that they wanted rooms, I offered to take Mr. Chatfield and the young man in. Of course, if I'd known how ill he was, I shouldn't. What I understood and mind you, I don't say they wilfully deceived me, for I don't think they did what I understood was that the young man simply wanted a real good rest. But he was evidently a deal worse than what even Dr. Valdey thought. He'd stopped at Dr. Valdey's surgery while Mr. Chatfield went to see about rooms, and they moved him from there straight in here. And, as I say, he was a deal worse than they thought much worse, and the doctor had to be fetched to him more than once during the afternoon. Still, Dr. Valdey himself never said to me that there was any immediate danger. But that's neither here nor there. The young fellow died that night." "That night!" exclaimed Gilling. "The night he came here?" "Very same night," assented Mrs. Salmon. "Brought in here about 2 in the afternoon, and died just before midnight, soon after Miss Chatfield came in from the theatre. Went very suddenly at the end." "Were you present?" asked Copplestone. "I wasn't. Nobody was with him but Mr. Chatfield. Miss Chatfield was getting her supper down here," replied Mrs. Salmon. "And I was busy elsewhere." "Was there an inquest, then?" inquired Gilling. "Oh, no!" said Mrs. Salmon, shaking her head. "Oh, no, there was no need for that. The doctor, you see, had been seeing him all day. Oh, no, the cause of death was evident enough in a way of speaking heart." "Did they bury him here, then?" asked Gilling. 2 days after," replied Mrs. Salmon. "Kept everything very quiet, they did. I don't believe Miss Chatfield told any of the theatre people. She went to her work just the same, of course. The old gentleman saw to everything funeral and all. I'll say this for them they gave me no unnecessary trouble, but still, there's trouble that is necessary when you've death in a house and a funeral at the door, and they ought to have given me something for what I did. But they didn't, so I considered it very mean. Mr. Chatfield, he stayed 2 days after the funeral, and when he left he just said that his daughter would settle up with me. But when she came to pay she added nothing to my bill, and she walked out remarking that if her father hadn't given me anything extra, she was sure she shouldn't. Shabby!" "Very shabby," agreed Gilling. "Well, you won't find my clients quite so mean, ma'am. But just a word don't mention this matter to anybody until you hear from me. And as I like to give some earnest of payment, here's a bank note which you can slip into your purse on account, you understand. Now, just a question or two did you hear the young man's name?" The landlady, whose spirits rose visibly on receipt of the bank note, appeared to reflect on hearing this question, and she shook her head as if surprised at her own inability to answer it satisfactorily. "Well, now," she said, "it may seem a queer thing to say, but I don't recollect that I ever did. You see, I didn't see much of him after he once got here. I was never in his room with them, and they didn't mention his name, that I can remember, when they spoke about him before me. I understood he was a relative cousin or something of that sort." "Didn't you see any name on the coffin?" asked Gilling. "I didn't," replied Mrs. Salmon. "You see, the undertaker fetched him away when him and his men brought the coffin, the next day. He took charge of the coffin for the second night, and the funeral took place from there. But I'll tell you what the undertaker'll know the name, and of course the doctor does they're both close by." Gilling took names and addresses, and once more pledging the landlady to secrecy, led Copplestone away. "That's the end of another chapter," he said when they were clear of that place. "We know now that Marston Greyle died there, in that very house, Copplestone, and that Peter Chatfield was with him. That's fact!" "And it's fact, too, that the daughter knows," observed Copplestone in a low voice. "Fact, too, that Addie Chatfield was in it," agreed Gilling. "Well, but what happened next? However, before we go on to that, there are three things to do in the morning. We must see this Dr. Valdey, and the undertaker, and Marston Greyle's grave." "And then?" asked Copplestone. "Stiff, big question," sighed Gilling. "Go back to town and report, I think, and find out if Swallow has discovered anything. And egad, there's a lot to discover! For you see we're already certain that at the stage at which we've arrived a conspiracy began conspiracy between Chatfield, his daughter, and the man who's been passing himself off as Marston Greyle. Now, who is the man? Where did they get hold of him? Is he some relation of theirs? All that's got to be found out. Of course, their object is very clear Marston Greyle, the real Simon Pure, was dead on their hands. His legal successor was his cousin, Miss Audrey. Chatfield knew that when Miss Audrey came into power his own reign as steward of Scarhaven would be brief. And so but the thing is so plain that one needn't waste breath on it. And I tell you what's plain, too, Copplestone Miss Audrey Greyle is the lady of Scarhaven. Good luck to her you'll no doubt be glad to communicate the glad tidings." Copplestone made no answer. He was utterly confounded by the recent revelations, and was wondering what the mother and daughter in the little cottage so far away in the grey north would say when all these things were told them. "Let's make dead certain of everything," he said after a long pause. "Don't let's leave any loophole." "Oh, we'll leave nothing here, at any rate," replied Gilling confidently. "But you'll find in the morning that we already know almost everything." In this he was right. The doctor's story was a plain one. The young man was very ill indeed when brought to him, and though he did not anticipate so early or sudden an end, he was not surprised when death came, and had of course no difficulty about giving the necessary certificate. Just as plain was the undertaker's account of his connection with the affair a very ordinary transaction in his eyes, and having heard both stories, there was nothing to do but to visit one of the adjacent cemeteries and find a certain grave, the number of which they had ascertained from the undertaker's books. It was easily found, and Copplestone and Gilling found themselves standing at a new tombstone, whereon the monumental mason had carved 4 lines: Mark Grey, born April 12th, 1884, died October 6th, 1912, aged 28 years. "Short, simple, eminently suited to the purpose," murmured Gilling as the two turned away. "Somebody thought things out quickly and well, Copplestone, when this poor fellow died. Do you know I've been thinking as we walked up here that if Bassett Oliver had never taken it into his head to visit Scarhaven that Sunday, this fraud would never have been found out. The chances were all against its ever being found out. Consider them! A young man who is an absolute stranger in England comes to take up an inheritance, having on him, no doubt, the necessary proofs of identification. He's met by one person only his agent. He dies next day. The agent buries him, under a false name, takes his effects and papers, gets some accomplice to personate him, introduces that accomplice to everybody as the real man, and there you are. Oh, Chatfield knew what he was doing! Who on earth, wandering in this cemetery, would ever connect Mark Grey with Marston Greyle?" "Just so but there was one danger spot which must have given Chatfield and his accomplices a good many uneasy hours," answered Copplestone. You know that Marston Greyle actually registered in his own name at Falmouth, and was known to the landlord and the doctor there." "Yes, and Falmouth is 300 miles from London and 500 from Scarhaven," replied Gilling dryly. "And do you suppose that whoever saw Marston Greyle at Falmouth cared two pins, comparatively, what became of him after he left there? No Chatfield was almost safe from detection as soon as he'd got that unfortunate young fellow laid away in that grave. However, we know now what we do know, and the next thing, now that we know Marston Greyle lies behind us there, is to get back to town and catch the chap who took his place. We'll wire to Swallow and to Petherton and get the next express." Sir Cresswell Oliver and Petherton were in confidence with Swallow at the solicitor's office when Gilling and Copplestone arrived there in the early afternoon. Gilling interrupted their conversation to tell the result of his investigations. Copplestone, watching the effect, saw that neither Sir Cresswell nor Petherton showed surprise. Petherton, indeed, smiled as if he had anticipated all that Gilling had to say. "I told you that I knew the Greyle family solicitors," he observed. "I find that they have only once seen the man whom we will call the Squire. Chatfield brought him there. He produced proofs of identification papers which Chatfield no doubt took from the dead man. Of course, the solicitors never doubted for a moment that he was the real Marston Greyle never dreamed of fraud. Well, the next step we must concentrate on finding this man, and Swallow has nothing to tell yet. He has never seen anything more of him. You'd better turn all your attention to that, Gilling, you and Swallow. As for Chatfield and his daughter, I suppose we shall have to approach the police." Copplestone presently went home to his rooms in Jermyn Street, puzzled and wondering. And there, lying on top of a pile of letters, he found a telegram from Audrey Greyle. It had been dispatched from Scarhaven at an early hour of the previous day, and it contained but 3 words: "Can you come?" Chapter 19. Of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 19. The Steam Yacht. Copplestone had seen and learned enough of Audrey Greyle during his brief stay at Scarhaven to make him assured that she would not have sent for him save for very good and grave reasons. It had been with manifest reluctance that she had given him her promise to do so. Her entire behaviour during the conference with Mr. Dennie and Gilling had convinced him that she had an inherent distaste for publicity and an instinctive repugnance to calling in the aid of strangers. He had never expected that she would send for him he himself knew that he should go back to her, but the return would be on his own initiative. There, however, was her summons, definite as it was brief. He was wanted and by her. And without opening one of his letters, he snatched up the whole pile, thrust it into his pocket, hurriedly made some preparation for his journey, and raced off to King's Cross. He fumed and fretted with impatience during the 6 hours' journey down to Norcaster. It was 10 o'clock when he arrived there, and as he knew that the last train to Scarhaven left at 9:30, he hurried to get a fast motor car that would take him over the last 20 miles of his journey. He had wired to Audrey from Peterborough, telling her that he was on his way and should motor out from Norcaster, and when he had found a car to his liking, he ordered its driver to go straight to Mrs. Greyle's cottage, close by Scarhaven Church. And just then he heard a voice calling his name, and turning, saw, running out of the station, a young, athletic looking man, much wrapped and cloaked, who waved a hand at him and whose face he had some dim notion of having seen before. "Mr. Copplestone!" panted the new arrival, coming up hurriedly. "I almost missed you. I got on the wrong platform to meet your train. You don't know me, though you may have seen me at the inquest on Mr. Bassett Oliver the other day. My name's Vickers Guy Vickers." "Yes?" said Copplestone. "And " "I'm a solicitor here in Norcaster," answered Vickers. "At least my firm, you know we sometimes act for Mrs. Greyle at Scarhaven. I got a wire from Miss Greyle late this evening, asking me to meet you here when the London train got in, and to go on to Scarhaven with you at once. She added the words 'urgent business,' so " "Then in heaven's name let's be off!" exclaimed Copplestone. "It'll take us a good hour and a quarter as it is. Of course," he went on, as they moved away through the Norcaster streets, "of course you haven't any notion of what this urgent business is?" "None whatever," replied Vickers. "But I'm quite sure that it is urgent, or Miss Greyle wouldn't have said so. No, I don't know what her exact meaning was, but, of course, I know there's something wrong about the whole thing at Scarhaven seriously wrong." "You do, eh?" exclaimed Copplestone. "What now?" "Ah! that I don't know," replied Vickers, with a dry laugh. "I wish I did. But you know how people talk in these provincial places. Ever since that inquest there have been all sorts of rumours. Every club and public place in Norcaster has been full of talk gossip, surmise, speculation naturally." "But about what?" asked Copplestone. "Squire Greyle, of course," said the young solicitor. "That inquest was enough to set the whole country talking. Everybody thinks they couldn't think otherwise that something is being hushed up. Everybody's agog to know if Sir Cresswell Oliver and Mr. Petherton are applying for a reopening of the inquest. You've just come from town, I believe did you hear anything?" Copplestone was wondering whether he ought to tell his companion of his own recent discoveries. Like all laymen, he had an idea that you can tell anything to a lawyer, and he was half minded to pour out the whole story to Vickers, especially as he was Mrs. Greyle's solicitor. But on second thoughts he decided to wait until he had ascertained the state of affairs at Scarhaven. "I didn't hear anything about that," he replied. "Of course, that inquest was a mere travesty of what such an inquiry should have been." "Oh, an utter farce!" agreed Vickers. "However, it produced just the opposite effect to that which the wire pullers wanted. Of course, Chatfield had squared that jury. But he forgot the press, and the local reporters were so glad to get hold of what was really spicy news that all the Norcaster and Northborough papers have been full of it everybody's talking of it, as I said. People are asking what this evidence from America is why was there such mystery about the whole thing, and so on. And since then everybody knows that Squire Greyle has left Scarhaven." "Have you seen Mrs. or Miss Greyle since the inquest?" asked Copplestone, who was anxious to keep off subjects on which he might be supposed to possess information. "Have you been over there?" "No, not since that day," replied Vickers. "And I don't care how soon we do see them, for I'm a bit anxious about this telegram. Something must have happened." Copplestone looked out of the window on his side of the car. Already they were clear of the Norcaster streets and on the road which led to Scarhaven. That road ran all along the coast, often at the very edge of the high, precipitous cliffs, with no more between it and the rocks far beneath than a low wall. It was a road of dangerous curves and corners which needed careful negotiation even in broad daylight, and this was a black, moonless and starless night. But Copplestone had impressed upon his driver that he must get to Scarhaven as quickly as possible, and he and his companion were both so full of their purpose that they paid no heed to the perpetual danger which they ran as the car tore round projections and down deep cuts at a speed which at other times they would have considered suicidal. And at just under the hour they ran on the level stretch by the Admiral's Arms, and looking down at the harbour saw the lighted portholes of some ship which lay against the south quay, and on the quay itself men moving about in the glare of lamps. "What's going on there?" said Vickers. "Late for a vessel to be loading at a place like this, where time's of no great importance." Copplestone offered no suggestion. He was hotly impatient to reach the cottage, and as soon as the car drew up at its gate he burst out, bade the driver wait, and ran eagerly up to the path to Audrey, who opened the door as he advanced. In another second he had both her hands in his own, and kept them there. "You're all right?" he demanded in tones which made clear to the girl how anxious he had been. "There's nothing wrong with you or your mother? Personally, I mean. You see, I didn't get your wire until this afternoon, and then I raced off as quick " "I know," she said, responding a little to the pressure of his hands. "I understand. You may be sure I shouldn't have wired if I hadn't felt it absolutely necessary. Somebody was wanted, and you'd made me promise, and so yes," she continued, drawing back as Vickers came up, "we were all right personally, but there's something very wrong indeed somewhere. Will you both come in and see mother?" Mrs. Greyle, looking worn and ill, appeared just then in the hall, and called to them to come in. She preceded them into the parlour, and turned to the young men as soon as Audrey closed the door. "I'm more thankful to see you gentlemen than I've ever been in my life for anything," she said. "Something is happening here which needs the attention of men. We women can't do anything. Let me tell you what it is. Yesterday morning, very early, the Squire's steam yacht, the Pike, was brought into the inner harbour and moored against the quay just opposite the park gates. We of course could see it, and as we knew he had gone away, we wondered why it was brought in there. After it had been moored, we saw that preparations of some sort were being made. Then men estate labourers began coming down from the house, carrying packing cases, which were taken on board. And while this was going on, Mrs. Peller, the housekeeper, came hurrying here, in a state of great consternation. She said that a number of men, sailors and estate men, were packing up and removing all the most valuable things in the house, the finest pictures, the old silver, the famous collection of china which Stephen John Greyle made, and spent thousands upon thousands of pounds in making, the rarest and most valuable books out of the library, all sorts of things of real and great value. Everything was being taken down to the Pike, and the estate carpenter, who was in charge of all this, said it was by the Squire's orders, and produced to Mrs. Peller his written authority. Of course, Mrs. Peller could do nothing against that, but she came hurrying to tell us, because she, like everybody else, is much exercised by these recent events, and so Audrey and I pocketed our pride and went to see Peter Chatfield. But Peter Chatfield, like his master, had gone. He had left home the previous evening, and his house was locked up." Copplestone and Vickers exchanged glances, and the young solicitor signed Mrs. Greyle to proceed. "Then," she added, "to add to that, as we came away from Chatfield's house we met Mr. Elkin, the bank manager from Norcaster. He had come over in a motor car to see me privately. He wanted to tell me, in relation to all these things, that within the last few days the Squire and Peter Chatfield had withdrawn from the bank the very large balances of two separate accounts. One was the Squire's own account, in his name. The other was an estate account, on which Chatfield could draw. In both cases, the balances withdrawn were of very large amount. Of course, as Mr. Elkin pointed out, it was all in order, and no objection could be raised. But it was unusual, for a large balance had always existed on both these accounts. And Mr. Elkin added, so many strange rumours are going about Norcaster and the district that he felt seriously uneasy, and thought it his duty to see me at once. And now, what is to be done? The house is being stripped of the best part of its valuables, and in my opinion, when that yacht sails it will be for some foreign port. What other object can there be in taking these things away? Of course, as nothing is entailed, and there are no heirlooms, everything is absolutely the Squire's property, so Copplestone, who had been realizing the serious significance of these statements, saw that it was time to speak, if energetic methods were to be taken at once. "I'd better tell you the truth," he said, interrupting Mrs. Greyle. "I might have told you, Vickers, as we came along, but I decided to wait until we got here and found out how things were. Mrs. Greyle, the man you speak of as the Squire is no more the owner of Scarhaven than I am. He is not Marston Greyle at all. The real Marston Greyle who came over from America died the day after he landed, in lodgings at Bristol, to which Peter Chatfield and his daughter had taken him, and he is buried in a Bristol cemetery under the name of Mark Grey. Gilling and I found that out during these last few days. It's an absolute fact. So the man who has been posing here as the rightful owner is an impostor." A dead silence followed this declaration. The mother and daughter, after one long look at Copplestone, turned and looked at each other. But Vickers, quick to realize the situation, started from his seat, with evident intention of doing something. "That's the truth?" he exclaimed, turning to Copplestone. "No possible flaw in it?" "None," replied Copplestone. "It's sheer fact." "Then in that case," said Vickers, "Miss Greyle is the owner of Scarhaven of everything in the house, of every stick, stone, and pebble about the place, and we must act at once. Miss Greyle, you will have to assert yourself. You must do what I tell you to do. You must get ready at once, this minute, and come down with me and Mrs. Greyle to that yacht and stop all these proceedings. In our presence you must lay claim to everything that's been taken from the house, yes, and to the yacht itself. Come, let's hurry." Audrey hesitated and looked at Mrs. Greyle. "Very well," she said quietly. "But not my mother." "No need," said Vickers. "You will have us with you." Audrey hurried from the room, and Mrs. Greyle turned anxiously to Vickers. "What shall you do?" she asked. "Warn all concerned," answered Vickers, with a snap of the jaw which showed Copplestone that he was a man of determination. "Warn them, if necessary, that the man they have known as Marston Greyle is an impostor, and that everything they are handling belongs to Miss Greyle. The Scarhaven people know me, of course there ought not to be any great difficulty with them, and as regards the yacht people " "You know," interrupted Mrs. Greyle, "that this man the impostor has made himself very popular with the people here. You saw how they cheered him after the inquest. You don't think there is danger in Audrey going down there?" "Wouldn't it be enough if you and I went?" suggested Copplestone. "It's very late to drag Miss Greyle out." "I'm sorry, but it's absolutely necessary," said Vickers. "If your story is true I mean, of course, since it is true Miss Greyle is owner and mistress, and she must be on the spot. It's all we can do, anyway," he continued, as Audrey, wrapped in a big ulster, came back to the parlour. "Even now we may be too late, and if that yacht once sails away from here " There were signs that the yacht's departure was imminent when they went down to the south quay and came abreast of her. The lights on the shore were being extinguished, the estate labourers were gone, only 2 or 3 sailors were busy with ropes and gear, and Vickers hurried his little party up a gangway and on to the deck. A hard faced, keen eyed man, evidently in authority, came forward. "Are you the captain of this vessel?" demanded Vickers, in tones of authority. "You are? I'm Mr. Vickers, solicitor, of Norcaster. I give you formal warning that the man you have known as Marston Greyle is not Marston Greyle at all, but an impostor. All the property which you have removed from the house, and now have on this vessel, belongs to this lady, Miss Audrey Greyle, lady of the Manor of Scarhaven. It is at your peril that you move it, or that you cause this vessel to leave this harbour. I claim the vessel and all that is on it on behalf of Miss Greyle." The man addressed listened in silent attention and showed no sign of any surprise. As soon as Vickers had finished he turned, hurried down a stairway, remained below for a few minutes, and came up again. "Will you kindly step this way, Miss Greyle and gentlemen?" he said politely. "You must remember that I am only a servant. If you will come down." He led them down the stairs, along a thickly carpeted passage, and opened the door of a lighted saloon. All unthinking, the three stepped in to hear the door closed and locked behind them. Chapter 20. Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 20. The Courteous Captain. Vickers sprang back at that door as the sharp click of the turning key caught his ear, and Copplestone, preceding him and following Audrey, who had advanced fearlessly into the cabin, pulled himself up with a sudden, sickening sense of treachery. The two young men looked at each other, and a dead silence fell on them and the girl. Then Vickers laid his hand on the door and shook it. "Locked in!" he muttered, with a queer glance at his companions. "What does that mean?" "Nothing good!" growled Copplestone, who was secretly cursing his own folly in allowing Audrey to leave the quay. "We're trapped that's what it means. Why we're trapped isn't a question that matters very much under the circumstances. The serious thing is that we certainly are trapped." Vickers turned to Audrey. "My fault!" he said contritely. "All my fault! But I meant it for the best. It was the thing to do. And who on earth could have foreseen this? Look here we've got to think pretty quick, Copplestone. That captain, now has he done this on his own hook, or is there somebody on board who's at the top of things?" "I don't see any good in thinking quick, or asking one's self questions," replied Copplestone. "We're locked in here. We've got Miss Greyle into this mess, and her mother will be anxious and alarmed. I wish we'd let this confounded yacht go where it liked before ever we'd " "Don't!" broke in Audrey. "That's no good. Mr. Vickers certainly did what he felt to be best and who could foresee this? and I'm not afraid, and as for my mother, if we don't return very soon, why, she knows where we are, and there are police in Scarhaven, and " "How long are we going to be where we are?" asked Copplestone grimly. "The thing's moving." There was no doubt of that very pertinent fact. Somewhere beneath them, machinery began to work; above them there was hurry and scurry as ropes and stays were thrown off. But so beautifully built was that yacht, and so almost sound proof the luxurious cabin in which they were prisoners, that little of the noise of departure came to them. However, there was no mistaking the increasing throb of the engines, nor the fact that the vessel was moving, and Vickers suddenly sprang on a lounge seat and moved away a silken screen which curtained a porthole window. "There's no doubt of that!" he exclaimed. "We're going through the outer harbour. We've passed the light at the end of the quay. What do these people mean by carrying us out to sea? Copplestone, with all submission to you, whether it's relevant or not, I wish we knew more of that captain chap." "I know him," remarked Audrey. "I've been on this yacht before. His name is Andrius. He's an American, or American Norwegian, or something like that." "And the crew?" asked Vickers. "Are they Scarhaven men?" "No," replied Audrey. "There isn't a Scarhaven man amongst them. My cousin you know whom I mean bought this yacht just as it stood, from an American millionaire, early this spring, and he took over the captain, crew, and everything." "So we're in the hands of strangers!" exclaimed Vickers, while Copplestone dug his hands into his pockets and began to stamp about. "I wish I'd known all that before we came on board." "But what harm can they do us?" said Audrey, incredulous of danger. "You don't suppose they'll want to murder us, surely? My own belief is that we should never have been locked up here if you hadn't let them know how much we know, Mr. Vickers." "Let them I don't understand," said Vickers, turning a puzzled glance on her. "Why," replied Audrey with a laugh which convinced both men of her fearlessness, "you let the captain see that we know a great deal, and he thereupon ran downstairs, presumably to tell somebody of what you said, and here's the result." "You think, then," suggested Vickers, "you think that " "I think the somebody, whoever he is, wants to know exactly how much we do know," answered Audrey with another laugh. "And so we're being carried off to be cross examined at somebody's leisure. Let's hope they won't use thumbscrews and that sort of thing. And anyway," she continued, looking from one to the other, "hadn't we better make the best of it? We're going out to sea that's certain. Here's the bar." A sudden lifting of the thickly carpeted door, a dip to the left, another to the right, a plunge forward, a drop back, then a settling down to a steady, persistent roll, showed her companions that Audrey was right. The yacht was crossing the bar which lay at the mouth of Scarhaven Bay. Outside that lay the North Sea, and Copplestone suddenly wondered which course the vessel was going to take north, east, or south. But before he could put his thoughts into words the door was suddenly unlocked, and Captain Andrius, suave, polite, deprecating, walked into the cabin. "A thousand pardons and two words of explanation!" he exclaimed, as he executed a deep bow to his lady prisoner. "First, Miss Greyle, I have sent a message to your mother that you are quite safe and will join her in due course. Second, this is merely a temporary detention. You shall all be landed all in good time." Vickers, as a legal man, assumed his most professional air. "Do you know what you are rendering yourself liable to, sir, by detaining us at all?" he demanded. "An action " Captain Andrius bowed again assumed his deprecating smile. He waved the two men to seats, and himself took a chair, with his back to the door by which he entered. "My dear sir," he said courteously, "you forget that I am but a servant. I am under orders. However, I give my word that no harm shall come to you, that you shall be treated with every polite attention, and that you shall be landed." "When and where?" asked Vickers. "Tomorrow, certainly," replied Andrius. "As to where, I cannot exactly say, but where you will be in touch with shall we say civilization?" He showed a set of fine white teeth in such a curious fashion as he spoke the last word that Copplestone and Vickers instinctively glanced at each other, with a mutual instinct of distrust. "Won't do!" said Vickers. "I insist that you put about and go into Scarhaven again." Andrius spread out his open palms and shook his head. "Impossible!" he answered. "We are already en voyage. Time presses. Be placable. Tomorrow you shall be released." Vickers was about to answer this appeal with an angry refusal to be either placable or tractable, but he suddenly stopped the words which rose to his tongue. There was something in all this some mystery, some queer game, and it might be worth while to find it out. "Where are you taking this yacht?" he demanded brusquely. "Come now." "I am under orders," said Andrius, with another smile. "Whose orders?" persisted Vickers. "Look here it's no use trying to burke facts. Who's on board this vessel? You know what I mean. Is the man who calls himself Squire of Scarhaven here?" Andrius shook his head quietly and gave his questioner a shrewd glance. "Mr. Vickers," he said meaningly, "I know you. You are a lawyer though a young one. Lawyers are guarded in their speech. Now, we are alone, we four. No one can hear anything we say. Tell me is that right what you said to me on deck that the man who has called himself Marston Greyle is not so at all?" "Absolutely right," replied Vickers. "An impostor?" demanded Andrius. "He is." "And never had any right to anything?" "No right whatever." "Then," said Andrius, with a polite inclination of his head and shoulders to Audrey, "the truth is that everything of the Scarhaven property belongs to this lady." "Everything!" exclaimed Vickers. "Land, houses, furniture, valuables everything. All the property which you have on this yacht pictures, china, silver, books, objects of art, as I am instructed, removed from the house are Miss Greyle's sole property. Once more I warn you of what you are doing, and I demand that you immediately return to Scarhaven. This very yacht belongs to Miss Greyle." Andrius nodded, looked fixedly at the young solicitor for a moment, and then rose. "I am obliged to you," he said. "That, of course, is your claim. But the other one, eh? It seems to me there might be something to be said for that, you know. So all I can do is to renew my assurance of polite attention, offer you our best accommodation which is luxurious and promise to land you somewhere tomorrow. Miss Greyle, we have 2 women servants on board. I shall send them to you at once and they will attend to you. Please consider them your own. You, gentlemen, will perhaps join me in my quarters? I have 2 spare cabins close to my own which are at your service." Copplestone and Vickers looked at each other and at Audrey, undecided and vaguely suspicious. But Audrey was evidently neither alarmed nor uneasy. She nodded a ready assent to the captain's proposal. "Thank you, Captain Andrius," she said coolly. "I know the 2 women. You may send one of them. Do what he suggests," she murmured, turning to Copplestone, who had moved close to her. "I'm not one scrap afraid of anything and it's only until tomorrow. He'll land us I'm sure of it." There was nothing for it, then, but to follow Andrius to his own comfortable quarters. There, utterly ignoring the strange circumstances under which they met, he played the part of host with genuine desire to make his guests feel at ease, and when he showed them to their berths a little later he emphasized his assurance of their absolute safety and liberty. "You see, gentlemen, your movements are untrammelled," he said. "You can go where you like on the yacht tomorrow morning. There is no restriction on you. Sleep well and tomorrow you are all free again, eh?" Copplestone got a word or two with Vickers alone. "What do you think?" he muttered. "Shall you sleep?" "My impression for I know what you're thinking about," said Vickers, "is that Miss Greyle's as safe as if she were in her mother's house. She's no fear herself, anyway. There's some mystery somewhere, and I can't make this Andrius man out at all, but I believe all's right as regards personal safety. There's Miss Greyle's cabin, anyhow, right opposite ours, and I can keep an eye and an ear open even when I'm asleep." But in spite of these assurances Copplestone slept little. He was up, dressed and on deck by sunrise, staring around him in a fresh autumn morning to get some notion of the yacht's whereabouts, and he had just managed to make out a mere filmy line of land far to the westward when Audrey appeared at his elbow. There was no one of any importance near them, and Copplestone impulsively seized her hands. "I've scarcely slept," he blurted out, gazing intently at her. "Couldn't blaming myself for letting you get into this confounded mess. You're all right?" Audrey responded a little to the pressure of his hands before she disengaged her own. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "It's nobody's fault. Don't blame Mr. Vickers. He couldn't foresee this. Yes, I'm all right, and I slept like a top. What's the use of worrying? Do you know," she went on, lowering her voice and drawing nearer to him, "I believe something's going to come of all this something that'll clear matters up once and for all." "Why?" asked Copplestone, wonderingly. "What makes you think that?" "Don't know instinct intuitiveness, perhaps," she answered. "Besides, I'm dead certain we're not the only people I don't mean crew and captain aboard the Pike. I believe there's somebody else. There's some mystery, anyway. Keep that to yourself," she said, as Andrius and Vickers appeared from below. "Don't show any sign. Wait to see how things turn out." She turned away from him to greet the other two as unconcernedly as if there was nothing unusual in the situation, and Copplestone marvelled at her coolness. He himself, not so well equipped with patience, was feverishly anxious to know how things would turn out, and when. But the day went by and nothing happened, except that Captain Andrius was very polite to his guests, and that the yacht, a particularly fast sailer, continued to make headway through the grey seas, sometimes in bare sight of land and sometimes out of it. To one or two inquiries as to the fulfilment of his promise, Andrius made no more answer than a reassuring nod. Once when Vickers pressed him, he replied curtly that the day was not yet over. Vickers drew Copplestone aside on hearing that. "Look here," he said, "I've been reckoning things up as near as I can. I make out that we've been running due north, or north east ever since we left Scarhaven last night. I reckon, too, that this vessel makes quite 22 or 3 knots an hour. We must be off the extreme north east coast of Scotland and night's coming on." "There are ports there that he can put into," said Copplestone. "The thing is, will he keep his promise? Remember, he must know very well that if we once land anywhere within reach of a telegraph office, we can wire particulars about him to every port in the world if we like. And he's got to go somewhere eventually, you know." Vickers shook his head as if this were a problem he would give up. It was beyond him, he said, to even guess at what Andrius was after, or what was going to happen. And nothing did happen until, as the three prisoners sat at dinner with their polite gaoler, the Pike came to a sudden stop and hung gently on a quiet sea. Andrius looked up and smiled. "A pleasant night for your landing," he remarked. "Don't hurry, but there will be a boat ready for you as soon as dinner is over." "And where are we?" asked Vickers. "That, my dear sir, you will see when you land," replied Andrius. "You will, at any rate, be quite comfortable for the night, and in the morning, I think, you will be able to journey wherever you wish to go." There was something in the smile which accompanied the last words which made Copplestone uneasy. But the prospect of regaining their liberty was too good he kept his own counsel. And half an hour later, he, Audrey and Vickers stood on deck, looking down on a boat alongside, in which were 2 or 3 of the crew and a man holding a lantern. In front was the dark sea, and ahead a darker mass which they took to be land. "You won't tell us what this place is?" said Vickers as he was about to follow the others into the boat. "It's on the mainland, of course?" "The morning light, my good sir, will show you everything," replied Andrius. "Be content that I have kept my promise you have come off luckily," he added with a significant look. Vickers felt a strange sense of alarm as the boat left the yacht. He noticed 2 or 3 suspicious circumstances. As soon as they got away, he saw that all the yacht's lights had been or were being darkened or entirely obscured. At a dozen boat lengths they could see her no more. Then a boat, swiftly pulled, passed them in the darkness, evidently coming from the shore to which they were being taken. It, too, carried no light. Nor were there any lights on the shore itself. All there was in utter darkness. They were on the shingle within a quarter of an hour. Within a minute or two, the yachtsmen had helped all 3 on to the beach, had carried up certain boxes and packages which had been placed in the boat, had set down the lighted lantern, jumped into the boat again and vanished in the darkness. And in the silence, broken only by the drip of water from the retreating oars and by the scarcely noticed ripple of the waves, Audrey voiced exactly what her two companions felt. "Andrius has kept his word and cheated us. We're stranded." From somewhere out of the darkness came a groan, deep and heartfelt, as if in entire agreement with Audrey's declaration. That it proceeded from a human being was evident enough, and Vickers hastily snatched up the lantern and strode in the direction from which it came. And there, seated on the shingle, his whole attitude one of utter dejection and misery, the three castaways found a sharer of their sorrows. Peter Chatfield. Chapter 21 of Scarhaven Keep. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 21 Marooned. To each of these three young people this was the most surprising moment which life had yet afforded. It was an astonishing thing to find a fellow mortal there at all, but to find that mortal was the Scarhaven estate agent was literally short of marvellous. What was also astounding was to see Chatfield's only too evident distress. Swathed in a heavy, old fashioned ulster, with a plaid shawl round his shoulders and a deerstalker hat tied over head and ears with a bandana handkerchief, he sat on the beach nursing his knees, slightly rocking his fleshy figure to and fro and moaning softly with the regularity of a minute bell. His eyes were fixed on the dark expanse of waters at his feet. His lips, when he was not moaning, worked incessantly. As he rocked his body, he beat his toes on the shingle. Clearly, Chatfield was in a bad way, mentally. That he was not so badly off materially was made evident by the presence of a half open kit bag which obviously contained food and a bottle of spirits. For any notice that he took of them, Audrey, Vickers and Copplestone might have been no more than the pebbles on which they stood. In spite of the fact that Vickers shone the light on his fat face, and that three inquisitive pairs of eyes were trained on it, Chatfield continued to stare moodily and disgustedly out to sea, and to take no notice of his gratuitous company. And so utterly extraordinary was his behaviour and attitude that Audrey suddenly and almost involuntarily stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Chatfield!" she exclaimed. "What's the matter? Are you ill?" The emphasis which she gave to the last word roused some quality of Chatfield's subtle intellect. He flashed a swift look at his questioner, a look of mingled contempt and derision spiced with a dash of sneering humour, and he found his tongue. "Ill!" he snorted. "Ill! She asks if I'm ill me, a respectable man what's maltreated and robbed before his own eyes by them as ought to fall in humble gratitude at his feet. Ill! Aye, ill with something that's worse nor any bodily aches and pains. Let me tell you that but not done for, neither." "He's all right," said Copplestone. "That's a flash of his old spirit. You're all right, Chatfield, aren't you? And who's robbed and maltreated you? And how and when especially when did you come here?" Chatfield looked up at his old assailant with a glare of dislike. "You keep your tongue to yourself, young feller!" he growled. "I should never ha' been here at all if it hadn't been for the likes of you. A poke in your nose where it isn't wanted. It's 'cause of you three coming aboard of that there yacht last night as I'm here a castaway." "Well, we're castaways, too, Mr. Chatfield," said Audrey, "and we can't help believing that it's all your naughty conduct that's made us so. Why don't you tell the truth?" Chatfield uttered a few grumpy and inarticulate sounds. "It'll be a bad day for more than one when I do that as I will," he muttered presently. "Oh, aye, I'll tell the truth when it suits me. But I'll be out of this first." "You'll never get out of this first or last unless you tell us how you got in," said Vickers, assuming a threatening tone. "You'd better tell us all about it, you know. Come, now you know me and my firm." Chatfield laughed grimly and shook his much swathed head. "I ought to," he said. I've given 'em more than one nice job, and said naught about their bills o' costs, neither, my lad. You keep a civil tongue in your mouth I ain't done for yet, no ways. You let me get off this here place, wherever it is, and within touch of a telegraph office, and I'll make somebody suffer." "Andrius, of course," said Copplestone. "Come now, he put you ashore before he sent us off, didn't he? Why don't you own up?" "Never you mind, young feller!" retorted Chatfield. "I was feeling very cast down, but I'm better. I've something that'll keep me going revenge. I'll show 'em once I'm off this place I will so!" "Look here, Chatfield," said Vickers. "Do you know where this place is? What is it? Is it on the mainland, or is it an island, or where are we? It's all very well talking about getting off, but when and how are we to get off? Why don't you be sensible and tell us what you know?" The estate agent arose slowly and ponderously, drawing his shawl about him. He looked out seawards. In that black waste the steady beat of the yacht's propellers could be clearly heard, but not a gleam of light came from her, and it was impossible to decide in which direction she was going. And Chatfield suddenly shook his fist at the throbbing sound which came in regular pulsations through the night. "Never mind!" he said sneeringly. "We aren't at the North Pole, neither. I ain't a seafaring man, but I've a good idea of where we are. And perhaps there won't be naught to take me off when it's daylight, and perhaps there won't be no telegraphs near at hand, nor within 100 miles, and perhaps there ain't such a blessed person as that there Marconi and his wireless in the world. Oh, no just you wait, my fine fellers that's all." "He's not addressing us, Vickers," said Copplestone. "You're decidedly better, Chatfield you're quite better. The notion of revenge and of circumvention has come to you like balm. But you'd a lot better tell us who you're referring to, and why you were put ashore. Listen, Chatfield there's property of your own on that yacht, eh? That it? Come, now!" Chatfield gave his questioner a look of indignant scorn. He stooped for the kit bag, picked it up, and turned away. "I don't want to have naught to do with you," he remarked over his shoulder. "You keep yourselves to yourselves, and I'll keep myself to myself. If it hadn't been for what you blabbed out last night, them ungrateful devils 'd never have had such ideas put into their heads." As if he knew his way, Chatfield plodded heavily up the beach and was lost in the darkness, and the three left behind stood helplessly staring at each other. For a long time there was silence, broken only by the agent's heavy tread on the shingle. At last Vickers spoke. "I think I can see through all this," he said. Chatfield's cryptic utterances were somewhat suggestive. Robbed, maltreated them as ought to have fallen in humble gratitude at his feet. Vengeance, revenge, Marconi telegrams, ungrateful devils ah, I see it. Chatfield had associates on the Pike, probably the impostor himself and Andrius. Probably, too, he had property of his own, as you suggested to him, Copplestone. The whole gang was doubtless off with their loot to far quarters of the globe. Very good the other members have shelved Chatfield. They've done with him. But not if he knows it that man will hunt the Pike and her people, whoever they are, relentlessly when he gets off this." "I wish we knew what it is that we're on," said Copplestone. "Impossible till daybreak," replied Vickers. "But I've an idea. This is probably one of the 70 odd islands of the Orkneys. I've sailed round here before. If I'm right, it's most likely one of the outlying and uninhabited ones. Andrius, or his controlling power, has dropped us and Chatfield here, knowing that we may have to spend a few days on this island before we succeed in getting off. Those few days will mean a great deal to the Pike. She can be run into some safe harbourage on this coast, given a new coat of paint and a new name, and be off before we can do anything to stop her. I allow Chatfield to be right in this that my perhaps too hasty declaration to Andrius revealed to that gentleman how he could make off with other people's property." "Nothing will make me believe that Andrius is the solely responsible person for this last development," said Copplestone moodily. "There were other people on board, cleverly concealed. And what are we going to do?" Audrey had stepped away from the circle of light made by the lantern, and was gazing steadily in the direction which Chatfield had taken. "Those are cliffs, surely," she said presently. "Hadn't we better go up the beach and see if we can't find some shelter until morning? Fortunately, we're all warmly clad, and Andrius was considerate enough to throw rugs and things into the boat, as well as provisions. Come along! After all, we're not so badly off, and we have the satisfaction of knowing that we can keep Chatfield under observation. Remember that." But in the morning, when the first gleam of light came across the sea, and Vickers, leaving his companions to prepare some breakfast from the store of provisions which had been sent ashore with them, set out to make a first examination of their surroundings, the agent was not to be seen. What was to be seen was a breach of rock, sand, shingle, not a mile in length, lying at the foot of high cliffs, and on the grey sea in front not a sign of a sail, nor a wisp of smoke from a passing steamer. The apparent solitude and isolation of the place was as profound as the silence which overhung everything. Vickers made his way up the cliffs to their highest point and from its summit took a leisurely view of his surroundings. He saw at once that they were on an island, and that it was but one of many which lay spread out over the sea towards the north and the west. It was a wedge shaped island this, and the cliffs on which he stood and the beach beneath formed the widest side of it. From thence its lines drew away to a point in the distance which he judged to be 2 miles off. Between him and that point lay a sloping expanse of rough land, never cultivated since creation, whereon there were vast masses of rock and boulder but no sign of human life. No curling column of smoke went up from hut or cottage. His ears caught neither the bleating of sheep nor the cry of shepherd. All was still as only such places can be still. Nor could he perceive any signs of life on the adjacent islands, which, to be sure, were not very near. From the sea mists which wrapped one of them he saw projecting the cap of a mountainous hill. That hill he recognized as being on one of the principal islands of the group, and he then knew that he and his companions had been set down on one of the outlying islands which, from its position, was not in the immediate way of passing vessels nor likely to be visited by fishermen. He was turning away from the top of the cliffs after a long and careful inspection, when he caught sight of a man's figure crossing the rocky slope between him and this far off point. That, he said to himself, was Chatfield. Did Chatfield know of any place at that point visited by fishing craft from the other islands? Had Chatfield ever been in the Orkneys before? Was there any method in his wanderings? Or was he, too, merely examining his surroundings, considering which was the likeliest part of the island from which to attract attention? In the midst of these speculations, a sudden resolution came to him. One or other of the three must keep an eye on Chatfield. Night or day, Chatfield must be watched. And having already seen that Copplestone and Audrey had an unmistakable liking for each other's society and would certainly not object to being left together, he determined to watch Chatfield himself. Hurrying down the cliffs, he hastily explained the situation to his companions, took some food in his hands, and set out to follow the agent wherever he went. Chapter 22 of Scarhaven Keep. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 22 The Old Hand. Half an hour later, when Vickers regained the top of the cliff and once more looked across the island towards the far off point, the figure which he had previously seen making for it had turned back, was plodding steadily across the coarse grass and rock strewn moorland in his own direction. Chatfield had evidently taken a bird's eye view of the situation from the vantage point of the slope and had come to the conclusion that the higher part of the island was the most likely point from which to attract attention. He came steadily forward, a big, lumbering figure in the light mist, and Vickers, as he went on to meet him, eyed him with a lively curiosity, wondering what secrets lay carefully locked up in the man's heart, and what happened on the pike that made its captain or its owner bundle Chatfield out of it like a box of bad goods for which there was no more use. And as he speculated, they met, and Vickers saw at once that the old fellow's mood had changed during the night. An atmosphere of smug oiliness sat upon Chatfield in the freshness of the morning, and he greeted the young solicitor in tones which were suggestive of a chastened spirit. "Morning, Mr. Vickers," he said. "A sweetly pretty spot it is that we find ourselves in, sir. Nevertheless, one's affairs sometimes makes us long to quit the side of beauty, however much we would tarry by it. In plain words, Mr. Vickers, I want to get out of this, and I've been looking round, and my opinion is that the best thing we can do is to start as big a fire as we can find stuff for on yon bluff and keep a feeding on it. In the meantime, while you're considering of that, I'll burn something of my own. I'm weary." He dropped down on a convenient boulder of limestone, settled his big frame comfortably, and producing a pipe and a tobacco pouch, proceeded to smoke. Vickers himself took another boulder and looked inquisitively at his strange companion. He felt sure that Chatfield was up to something. "You say 'we' now," he remarked suddenly. "Last night you said you didn't want to have anything to do with us. We were to keep to ourselves, and " "Well, well, Mr. Vickers," broke in Chatfield, "one says things at one time that one wouldn't say at another, you know. Facts is facts, sir, and Providence has made us companions in distress. I've naught against you, nor against the girl. As for t'other man, he's of an interfering nature but I forgive him, he's young. I don't bear no ill will things being as they are. I've had time to reflect since last night, and I don't see no reason why Miss Greyle and me shouldn't come to terms through you." Vickers lighted his own pipe and took some time over it. "What are you after, Chatfield?" he asked at length. "Something, of course. You say you want to come to terms with Miss Greyle. That, of course, is because you know very well that Miss Greyle is the legal owner of Scarhaven, and that " Chatfield waved his pipe. "I don't!" he answered with what seemed genuine eagerness. "I don't know naught of the sort. I tell you, Mr. Vickers, I do not know that the man what we've known as the Squire of Scarhaven for a year gone by is not the rightful Squire. I do not! Fact, sir. But" he lowered his voice, and his sly eyes became slyer and craftier "but I won't deny that during this last week or two I may have had my suspicions aroused that there was something wrong. I don't deny that, Mr. Vickers." Vickers heard this with amazement. Young as he was, he had had various dealings with Peter Chatfield, and he had an idea that he knew something of him, subtle old fellow though he was, and he believed that Chatfield was now speaking the truth. But in that case, what of Copplestone's revelation about the Falmouth and Bristol affair, and the dead man? He thought rapidly, and then determined to take a strong line. "Chatfield," he said, "you're trying to bluff me. It won't do. Things are known I know 'em. I'll be candid with you the time's come for that. I'll tell you what I know it'll all have to come out. You know very well that the real Marston Greyle's dead you were with him when he died. What's more, you buried him at Bristol under the name of Mark Grey. Hang it all, man, what's the use of lying about it? You know that's all true." He was watching Chatfield's big face keenly, and he was astonished to see that his dramatic impeachment produced no more effect than a slightly superior smile. Instead of being floored, Chatfield was distinctly unimpressed. "Aye!" he said reflectively. "Aye I expected to hear that. That's Copplestone's work, of course. I knew he was some sort of detective as soon as I got speech with him. His work and that there Sir Cresswell Oliver's as is making a mountain out of a molehill about his brother, who of course broke his neck quite accidental, poor man, and of that London lawyer, Petherton. Aye, but all the same, Mr. Vickers, it won't alter matters nohow." "Good heavens, man, what do you mean?" exclaimed Vickers, who was becoming more and more mystified. "Do you mean to tell me come, Chatfield, I'm not a fool! Why, Copplestone has found it all out! There's no need to keep it secret now. You were with Marston Greyle when he died. You registered his death as Marston Greyle, and " Chatfield laughed softly, and gave his companion a swift glance out of one corner of his right eye. "And put another name on a bit of a tombstone 6 months afterwards, what?" he said quietly. "Mr. Vickers, when you're as old as I am, you'll know that this here world is as full o' puzzles as yon sea's full o' fish." Vickers could only stare at his companion in speechless silence after that. He felt that there was some mystery about which Chatfield evidently knew a great deal while he knew nothing. The old fellow's coolness, his ready acceptance of the Bristol facts, his almost contemptuous brushing aside of them, reduced Vickers to a feeling of helplessness. And Chatfield saw it, and laughed, and drawing a pocket flask out of his garments, helped himself to a tot of spirits, after which he good naturedly offered like refreshment to Vickers, but Vickers shook his head. "No, thanks," he said. He continued to stare at Chatfield much as he might have stared at the Sphinx if she had been present. And in the end he could only think of one word. "Well?" he asked lamely. "Well?" "As to what, now?" inquired Chatfield with a sly smile. "About what you said," replied Vickers. "Miss Greyle, you know. I'm about thoroughly tied up with all this. You evidently know a lot. Of course you won't tell. You're devilishly deep, Chatfield. But between you and me, what do you mean when you say that you don't see why you and Miss Greyle shouldn't come to terms?" "Didn't I say that during this last week or two I'd had my suspicions about the Squire?" asked Chatfield. "I did. I have had them suspicions got 'em stronger than ever since last night. So what I say is this if things should turn out that Miss Greyle's the rightful owner of Scarhaven, and if I help her to establish her claim, and if I help, too, to recover them valuables that are on the Pike there's a good £60,000 to £80,000 worth of stuff silver, china, paintings, books, tapestry, on that there craft, Mr. Vickers if, I say, I do all that, what will Miss Greyle give me? That's it, in a plain way of speaking." "I thought it was," said Vickers dryly. "Of course. Very well you'd better come and talk to Miss Greyle. Come on now." Copplestone and Audrey, having made a breakfast from the box of provisions which Andrius had been good enough to send ashore with them, had climbed to the head of the cliff after Vickers, and they were presently astonished beyond measure to see him returning with Chatfield under outward signs which suggested amity, if not friendship. They paused by a convenient nook in the rocks and silently awaited the approach of these two strangely assorted companions. Vickers, coming near, gave them a queer and a knowing look. "Mr. Chatfield," he said gravely, "has had the night in which to reflect. Mr. Chatfield desires peaceable relations. Mr. Chatfield doesn't see now, having reflected why he and Miss Greyle shouldn't be on good terms. Mr. Chatfield desires to discuss these terms. Is that right, Chatfield?" "Quite right, sir," assented the agent. He had been regarding the couple who faced him benevolently and indulgently, and he now raised his hat to them. "Servant, ma'am," he said with a bow to Audrey. "Servant, sir," he continued, with another bow to Copplestone. "It's far better to be at peace one with another than to let misunderstandings exist for ever. Mr. Copplestone, sir, you and me's had words in times past. I brush 'em away, sir, like that there the memory's departed. I desire naught but better feelings. Happen Mr. Vickers'll repeat what's passed between him and me." Copplestone stood rooted to the spot with amazement while Vickers hastily epitomized the recent conversation. His mouth opened and his speech failed him. But Audrey laughed and looked at Vickers as if Chatfield were a new sort of entertainment. "What do you say to this, Mr. Vickers?" she asked. "Well, if you want to know," replied Vickers, "I believe Chatfield when he says that he does not know that the Squire is not the Squire. May seem strange, but I do. As a solicitor, I do." "Great Scott!" exclaimed Copplestone, finding his tongue. "You believe that?" "I've said so," retorted Vickers. "Thank you, sir," said Chatfield. "I'm obliged to you. Mr. Copplestone, sir, doesn't yet understand that there's a deal of conundrum in life. He'll know better some day. He'll know, too, that the poet spoke truthful when he said that things isn't what they seem." Copplestone turned angrily on Vickers. "Is this a farce?" he demanded. "Good heavens, man, you know what I told you!" "Mr. Chatfield has a version," answered Vickers. "Why not hear it?" "On terms, Mr. Vickers," remarked Chatfield. "On terms, sir." "What terms?" asked Audrey. "To Mr. Chatfield's personal advantage, of course." Chatfield, who was still the most unconcerned of the group, seated himself on the rocks and looked at his audience. "I've said to Mr. Vickers here that if I help Miss Greyle to the estate I ought to be rewarded handsome," he said. "Mind you, I don't know that I can, for as I say, I do not know, as a matter of strict fact, that this man as we've called the Squire isn't the Squire. But recent events very recent events has made me suspicious that he isn't, and happen I can do a good bit a very good bit to turning him out. Now, if I help in that there work, Will Miss Greyle continue me in my post of estate agent at Scarhaven?" "Not for any longer than it will take to turn you out of it, Mr. Chatfield," replied Audrey with an energy and promptitude which surprised her companions. "So we need not discuss that. You will never be my agent." "Very good, ma'am. That's quite according to my expectations," said Chatfield meekly. "I was always a misunderstood man. However, this here proposition will perhaps be more welcome. It's always been understood that I was to have a retiring pension of £500 per annum. The family has always promised it I've letters to prove it. Will Miss Greyle stand to that if she comes in? I've been a faithful servant for nigh on to 50 years, Mr. Vickers, as all the neighbourhood is aware." "If I come in, as you call it, you shall have your pension," said Audrey. Chatfield slowly felt in a capacious inner pocket and produced a large note book and a fountain pen. He passed them to Vickers. "We'll have that there in writing, signed and witnessed," he said. "Put, if you please, Mr. Vickers, 'I agree that if I come into the Scarhaven estate, Peter Chatfield shall at once be pensioned off with £500 per year, to be paid quarterly. Same to be properly assured to him for his life.' And then if Miss Greyle'll sign that document and you gentlemen'll witness it, I shall consider that henceforth I'm in Miss Greyle's service. And," he added, with a significant glance all round, "I shall be a deal more use as a friend nor what I should be as what you might term an enemy. Mr. Vickers knows that." Vickers held a short consultation with Audrey, the result of which was that the paper was duly signed, witnessed and deposited in Chatfield's pocket. And Chatfield nodded his satisfaction. "All right," he said. "Now then, ma'am and gentlemen, the next thing is to get away out o' this, and get on the track o' them as put us here. We'd better start a big fire out of this dry stuff." "But what about these revelations you were going to make?" said Vickers. "I understood you were to tell us " "Sir," replied Chatfield, "I'll tell and I'll reveal in due course and in good order. Events, sir, is the thing. Let me get to the nearest telegraph office and we'll have some events right smart. Let me attract attention I've sailed in these seas before. There's steamers goes out o' Kirkwall yonder, frequent. We must get hold of one. A telegraph office that's what I want. I'm a going to set up a blaze, and I'll set up a blaze elsewhere as soon as I can lay hands on a bundle o' telegraph forms." He leisurely took off his shawl and overcoat, laid them on a shelf of rock, and moved away to collect the dry stuff which lay to hand. The three young people exchanged glances. "What's this new mystery?" asked Audrey. "Oh, bluff! Some deep game of his own," growled Copplestone. "He's the most consummate old liar I ever " "You're wrong this time, old chap," interrupted Vickers. "He's a bad 'un, but he's on our side now I'm convinced. It is a game he's playing, and a deep one, and I don't know what it is, but it's for our benefit. Chatfield simply transferred his interest and influence to us that's all. For his own purposes, of course, and " He suddenly paused, gazed seaward, and then jumped to his feet. "Chatfield!" he called quietly. "You needn't light any fire. Here's a steamer!" Chapter 23 of Scarhaven Keep. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 23 The Yacht Comes Back. Chatfield, his arms filled with masses of dried bracken and coarse grass, turned sharply on hearing Vickers' call and stared hard and long in the direction which the young solicitor pointed out. His small, crafty eyes became dilated to their full extent. Suddenly they contracted again with a look of cunning satisfaction, and throwing away his burdens he drew out a big, many coloured handkerchief and mopped his high forehead as if the perspiration which burst out were the result of intense mental relief. "Didn't I know we should be rescued from this here imprisonment!" he cried with unctuous joy. "Thought they'd pinned me here for the best part of a week, no doubt, while they could get theirselves quietly away far away. But it's my experience that them as has served the Lord's never deserted, Mr. Vickers, and if you live as long as " "Don't be blasphemous, Chatfield!" said Vickers curtly. "None of that! What we'd better think about is the chance of that steamer sighting us. We'll light that fire, anyway." "She's coming straight on for the island," remarked Copplestone, who had been narrowly watching the approaching vessel. "So straight that you'd think she was actually making for it." "She'll be some craft bound for Kirkwall," said Vickers, pointing northward to the main group of islands. "And in that case she'll probably take this channel on our west. That fire, now come on, all of you, and let's make as big a smoke as we can get out of this stuff." The weather being calm and the grass and bracken which they heaped together as dry as tinder, there was little difficulty about raising a thick column of smoke which presently rose high in the sky. But Audrey, turning away from the successful result of their labours, suddenly glanced at Copplestone with a look that challenged an answer to her own thoughts. They were standing a little apart from the others, and she lowered her voice. "I say," she murmured, "I don't think we need have bothered ourselves to light that fire. That vessel, whatever it is making for us. Look!" Copplestone shaded his eyes and stared out across the sea. The steamer was by that time no more than 2 or 3 miles away, but she was coming towards them in a dead straight line, and as she was accordingly bow on, and as her top deck and lamps were obscured by clouds of black smoke pouring furiously from her funnels, they could make little out of her appearance. Copplestone's first notion was that she was a naval patrol boat or a torpedo destroyer. Whatever she was, it seemed certain that she was heading direct for the island, at that very point on which the fugitives had been landed the previous night. And it was very evident that she was in a great hurry to make her objective. "I think you're right," he said, turning to Audrey. "But it's strange that any vessel should be making for an uninhabited island like this. What but you've got some notion in your mind," he broke off suddenly, seeing her glance at him again. "What is it?" Audrey shook her head, with a cautious look at Chatfield. "I was wondering if that's the Pike. Come back!" she whispered. "And if it is why?" Copplestone started and took a longer and keener look at the vessel. Before he could speak again, Vickers called out cheerily across the rocks. "Come on, you two!" he cried. "She's seen us she's coming in. They'll have to send off a boat. Let's get down to the beach so that they'll know where there's a safe landing." He sprang over the edge of the cliff and hurried down the rough path. Chatfield, picking up his coat and shawl, prepared to follow him. Audrey and Copplestone lingered until he, too, had begun to lumber downward. "If that is the Pike," said Audrey, "there is something wrong. Whoever it is that is on the Pike wouldn't come back to take us." "You think there is somebody on the Pike somebody other than Andrius?" suggested Copplestone. "I believe the man who calls himself Marston Greyle was on the Pike," announced Audrey. "I've always thought so. Whether Chatfield knew that or not, I don't know. My own belief is that Chatfield did know. I believe Chatfield was in with them, as the saying is. I think they were all running away with as much of the Scarhaven property as they could lay hands on, and that having got it, they bundled Chatfield out and dumped him down here, having no further use for him. And if that's the Pike, and they're returning here, it's because they want Chatfield." Copplestone suddenly recognized that feminine instinct had solved a problem which masculine reason had so far left unsolved. "By gad!" he exclaimed softly. "Then if that is so, this is merely another of Chatfield's games. You don't believe him?" "I would think myself within approachable distance of lunacy if I believed a word that Peter Chatfield said," she answered calmly. "Of course, he is playing a game of his own all through. He shall have his pension, if I have the power to give it. But believe him? Oh, no!" "Let's follow them," said Copplestone. "Something's going to happen if that is the Pike." "Look there, then!" exclaimed Audrey as they began to descend the cliff. "Chatfield's already uneasy." She pointed to the beach below, where Chatfield, now fully overcoated and shawled again, had mounted a ridge of rock, and while gazing intently at the vessel was exchanging remarks with Vickers, who had evidently said something which had alarmed him. They caught Chatfield's excited ejaculations as they hurried over the sand. "Oh, don't say that, Mr. Vickers!" he was saying imploringly. "For God's sake, Mr. Vickers, Don't suggest them there sort of thoughts. You make me feel right down poorly, Mr. Vickers, to say such. It's worse than a bad dream, Mr. Vickers. No, sir, no surely you're mistaken." "Bet you a fiver to a halfpenny it's the Pike," retorted Vickers. "I know her lines. Besides, she's heading straight here. Copplestone!" he cried, turning to the advancing couple. "Do you know I believe that's the Pike?" Copplestone gave Audrey's elbow a gentle squeeze. "Look at old Chatfield!" he whispered. "By gad, look at him!" "Yes!" he called loudly. "We know it's the Pike we saw that from the top of the cliffs. She's coming straight in." "Oh, yes, it's the Pike!" exclaimed Audrey. "Aren't you delighted, Mr. Chatfield?" The agent suddenly turned his big fat face towards the three young people, with such an expression of craven fear on it that the sardonic jest which Copplestone was about to voice died away on his lips. Chatfield's creased cheeks and heavy jowl had become white as chalk. Great beads of sweat rolled down them. His mouth opened and shut silently, and suddenly, as he raised his hands and wrung them, his knees began to quiver. It was evident that the man was badly, terribly afraid. And as they watched him in amazed wonder, his eyes began to search the shore and the cliffs as if he were some hunted animal seeking any hole or cranny in which to hide. A sudden swelling of the light wind brought the steady throb of the oncoming engines to his ears, and he turned on Vickers with a look that made the onlookers start. "For goodness' sake, Mr. Vickers!" he said in a queer, strained voice. "For heaven's sake, let's get ourselves away! Mr. Vickers it ain't safe for none of us. We'd best to run, sir. Let's get to the other side of the island there's caves there places let's hide till something comes from the other islands, or till these folks goes away. I tell you, it's dangerous for us to stop here." "We're not afraid, Chatfield," replied Vickers. "What ails you? Why, man, you couldn't be more afraid if you'd murdered somebody. What do you suppose these people want? You, of course. And you can't escape. If they want you, they'll search the island till they get you. You've been deceiving us, Chatfield there's something you've kept back. Now what is it? What have they come back for?" "Yes, Mr. Chatfield, what has the Pike come back for?" repeated Audrey, coming nearer. "Come, now, hadn't you better tell?" "It is the Pike," remarked Copplestone. "Look there! And they're going to send in a boat. Better be quick, Chatfield." The agent turned an ashen face towards the yacht. She had swung round and come to a halt, and the rattle of a boat being let down came menacingly to the frightened man's ears. He tittered a deep groan, and his eyes again sought the cliffs. "It's not a bit of good, Chatfield," said Vickers. "You can't get away. Good heavens, man, what are you so frightened for?" Chatfield moaned and drew haltingly nearer to the other three, as if he found some comfort in their mere presence. "It's the money!" he whispered. "The money as was in the Norcaster Bank 2 lots of it. He the Squire gave me authority to get out his lot what was standing in his name, you know, and the other, the estate lot, that was standing in mine some £50,000 in all, Mr. Vickers. I had it all in gold, packed in sealed chests, and those on board there thought I took them chests aboard the Pike with me. I did take chests, d'ye see, but they'd lead in 'em. The real stuff is hidden buried never mind where. And I know what they've come back for. They've opened the chests I took on board, and they've found there's naught but lead. And they want me me! They'll torture me to make me tell where the real chests, the money is torture me! Oh, for God's sake, keep 'em away from me! Help me to hide help me to get away! And I'll tell Miss Greyle then where the money's hidden. Oh, Lord, they're coming! Mr. Vickers! Mr. Vickers!" He cast himself bodily at Vickers as if to clutch him, but Vickers stepped agilely aside, and Chatfield fell on the sand, where he lay groaning while the others looked from him to each other. "Ah!" said Vickers at last. "So that's it, is it, Chatfield? Trying to cheat everybody all round, eh? I suppose you'd have told Miss Greyle later that these people had collared all that gold, and then you'd have helped yourself to it. And now I know what you were doing on that yacht when we boarded it. You were one of the gang, and you meant to hook it with them." "I didn't I didn't!" screamed Chatfield, beating the sand with his hands and feet. "I meant to slip away from 'em at a Scotch port as we was to call at, and then " "Then you'd have gone back to the hidden chests and helped yourself," sneered Vickers. "Chatfield, you're a wicked old scoundrel, and an unmitigated liar. Give me that paper that Miss Greyle signed this instant!" "No!" interjected Audrey. "Let him keep it. He'll have trouble enough presently. It's very evident they mean to have him." Chatfield heard the last few words and looked round at the edge of the surf. The boat had grounded on the shingle, and half a dozen men had leapt from it and were coming rapidly up the beach. "Armed, by George!" exclaimed Copplestone. "No chance for you, Chatfield." The agent suddenly sprang to his feet with a howl of terror. He gave one more glance at the men and then he ran, clumsily, but with a speed made desperate by terror. He made straight for the rocks, and at that two of the men, at a word from their leader, raised their rifles and fired. And with a shriek that set all the echoes ringing, the sea birds screaming, and made Audrey clap her hands to her ears, Chatfield threw up his arms and dropped heavily on the sands. "That's sheer murder!" exclaimed Vickers as the yachtsman came running up. "You'll answer for that, you know unless you mean to murder all of us." The leader, a smiling faced fellow, touched his cap respectfully, and grinned from ear to ear. "Lor' bless you, sir, we shot 20 feet over his head!" he said. "He's too precious to shoot they want him badly on board there. Now then, men, pick him up and get him into the boat he'll come round quick enough when he finds he hasn't even a pellet in him. Handy, now. Captain's compliments, sir," he went on, turning again to Vickers, and pointing to certain things which were being unloaded from the boat. "And as he understands that no vessel will pass here for 2 more days, sir, he's sent you further provisions, some more wraps, and some books and papers." CHAPTER 24